We all know what it feels like to be overlooked, to stand in a room where nobody sees our worth. Lady Serenya lived this pain every single day as the nobles of Valdorian court whispered behind her back, calling her the unwanted bride. The courtiers laughed openly at her simple dress and quiet manner. They saw a woman without beauty or fortune. King Alaric saw something different. The battle-hardened warrior looked past what others mocked and recognized true strength. In her steady gaze, he saw years of surviving cruelty with grace. In her work-worn hands, he found more value than all the jeweled fingers in his court. When he stepped forward and took her hand, the entire hall fell silent in shock. What could this legendary king possibly see in the woman everyone else had rejected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds where King Alaric had spent the better part of his 47 years learning the art of war. His sword, Truthseeker, hung at his side, a blade that had tasted the blood of countless enemies and had never once failed him in battle. The steel bore the marks of 3 decades of conflict, its edge honed to perfection through experience that few men could claim and fewer still could survive. Alaric stood at the window of his private chambers, watching the young recruits practice their forms below. Their movements were clumsy, eager, filled with the kind of reckless confidence that only comes before a man has truly seen death. He remembered being like them once, back when he believed that strength alone could solve any problem, that a sharp sword and steady hand were all a king needed to rule wisely. Those days felt like another lifetime. The kingdom of Valdoria stretched out beyond the castle walls, a realm he had fought to protect and expand for more than 2 decades. Every village, every farming hamlet, every trading post bore the mark of his campaigns. He had united the fractured territories through conquest and diplomacy, forging alliances where possible and crushing resistance where necessary. His reputation as a warrior was unquestioned. Enemies spoke his name in whispers, allies sought his counsel, and his own people slept peacefully knowing their king would defend them to his last breath. But kingdoms needed more than warriors to survive. They needed heirs. The political reality had been weighing on his shoulders for months now. His advisors spoke of it in careful, measured tones during council meetings, always prefacing their words with phrases like, "for the good of the realm," and "to secure the succession." What they meant was simple. At 47, with no children and no queen, Alaric represented a vulnerability that enemy kingdoms could exploit. A single well-placed arrow, a moment of carelessness in battle, and Valdoria would descend into chaos as various nobles fought to claim the throne. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his life making the kingdom strong, only to discover that his greatest weakness was his solitude. A knock at the chamber door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter!" he called. Not turning from the window, Lord Marcellus, his chief advisor, stepped into the room with the careful gait of a man who had spent too many years navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. His grey beard was meticulously groomed, his robes expensive but not ostentatious, the perfect image of diplomatic wisdom. "Your Majesty, the delegation from House Ravenscroft has arrived." Alaric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. House Ravenscroft controlled the eastern trade routes, their wealth rivaling that of the royal treasury itself. They had been one of several noble families to offer a daughter for marriage, each proposition wrapped in layers of political advantage and economic benefit. And Lady Serenya? She accompanies them as requested. Marcellus hesitated, a flicker of something concern, perhaps, crossing his weathered features. "Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly, the court is curious about this choice." That was diplomatic language for the gossip and whispers that had been circulating since Alaric's announcement 3 weeks prior. He had reviewed the portraits and histories of 7 eligible noblewomen, each one prettier and more accomplished than the last, according to their families' carefully crafted presentations. Lady Cordelia of House Meridian was renowned as the most beautiful woman in 3 kingdoms. Lady Isabel of House Thornwick commanded vast holdings in the fertile southern valleys. Lady Vivian of House Goldmere could recite poetry in 4 languages and play the harp with such skill that grown men wept at her performances. And then there was Lady Serenya of House Ravenscroft. The portrait her family had sent showed a woman of perhaps 28 years, with brown hair that held no particular luster and features that could charitably be called plain. Her dowry was modest compared to the others, her accomplishments unremarkable. The report on her character mentioned that she was dutiful and quiet, words that suggested a woman who would cause no trouble but inspire no particular admiration either. Most kings would have dismissed her consideration immediately, but Alaric had learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence often came from what people didn't say rather than what they did. Lady Serenya's portrait showed eyes that held depth, not the vacant prettiness of someone who had never known hardship, but the steady gaze of a person who had faced difficulties and endured them. Her hands, visible in the formal pose, showed the slight calluses that came from real work. Most telling of all, her family's presentation of her was notably brief compared to the others, as if they themselves weren't entirely confident in her prospects. In Alaric's experience, the people others underestimated often possessed the greatest hidden strengths. Has she been treated with proper courtesy since her arrival? He asked. Marcellus's pause spoke volumes. The court has received her as befits her station, Your Majesty, which meant they had been coldly polite at best, openly dismissive at worst. Alaric could imagine the scene. Lady Serenya entering the great hall to face a sea of perfectly coiffed nobles who took one look at her simple dress and unremarkable appearance and immediately began calculating how this marriage might affect their own positions at court. They would whisper just loudly enough for her to hear, their comments designed to wound with surgical precision. The cruelty of courts was legendary, and Valdoria's was no exception. I'll receive them in the throne room within the hour, Alaric decided. See that Lady Serenya is given chambers befitting a potential queen, and make it clear that any discourtesy shown to her will be taken as a personal insult to the crown. Marcellus bowed deeply. Of course, Your Majesty. And the other families who have submitted proposals will be informed of my decision once it's made. After the advisor left, Alaric remained at the window, watching the young soldiers practice. One of them, a boy who couldn't be more than 16, was struggling with a training partner twice his size. The larger youth had superior reach and strength, landing blow after blow against the smaller boy's shield. But the smaller fighter kept his guard steady, waiting, watching, and when his opponent overextended on a particularly aggressive strike, he slipped past the bigger sword and landed a precise thrust that would have been fatal in real combat. Size and strength weren't everything. Sometimes the qualities that others dismissed as weaknesses could become the greatest advantages. An hour later, Alaric sat on the throne that his grandfather had carved from a single massive oak tree. The great hall buzzed with the conversation of assembled nobles, all of whom had managed to find urgent business that required their presence for this meeting. Word traveled fast in the castle, and everyone wanted to see the woman who had somehow captured their king's interest. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Lord Ravenscroft entered with his small retinue. He was a man of middle years, with the soft look that came from a lifetime of successful trading rather than battlefield service. Behind him walked his wife, Lady Ravenscroft, whose jewelry caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. And behind them both, almost lost in their shadows, walked Lady Serenya. The whispers started immediately. Alaric's expression remained neutral, but his eyes tracked every detail as the group approached. Lady Serenya wore a dress of deep blue wool, well made, but clearly not the latest fashion. Her dark hair was arranged simply, without the elaborate styling favored by court ladies. She walked with her head held high, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she was acutely aware of the scrutiny surrounding her. As they drew closer, Alaric found himself studying her face. The portrait had been accurate but incomplete. It captured her features, but not the intelligence in her eyes or the slight tightness around them that spoke of someone accustomed to being judged and found wanting. When she finally looked directly at him, he saw something that none of the other potential brides had possessed: genuine composure under pressure. She wasn't beautiful by conventional standards, but there was something compelling about her steadiness. Her refusal to be cowed by the whispers and stares surrounding her. Lord Ravenscroft completed the formal introductions, his voice carrying the careful enthusiasm of a merchant closing an important deal. "Your Majesty, it is our honor to present our daughter, Lady Serenya, for your gracious consideration." Lady Serenya stepped forward and offered a curtsy that was perfectly executed, neither too deep nor too shallow, holding just long enough to show proper respect without suggesting subservience. When she rose, her eyes met his again. "Your Majesty," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the great hall, and in that moment, Alaric made his decision. The silence that followed King Alaric's announcement stretched like a taut bowstring, ready to snap. He had spoken the words clearly, without hesitation, in a voice that carried to every corner of the great hall. "Lady Serenya of House Ravenscroft, I offer you my hand in marriage and the crown of Valdoria." The collective intake of breath from 300 nobles sounded like wind rushing through autumn leaves. Lady Cordelia, positioned prominently near the front of the assembled court in her gown of shimmer and gold, went pale as carved marble. The other potential brides and their families exchanged glances of shock and barely concealed outrage. Lady Serenya herself seemed frozen, her work-worn hands clasped before her as she stared up at the king with wide eyes. For a moment, Alaric wondered if she might refuse, if the weight of what he was offering, with all its burdens and expectations, might prove too much for someone who had clearly lived most of her life in the shadows of others' ambitions. Then she found her voice. "Your Majesty honors me beyond my deserving," she said, and though her words were soft, they carried clearly in the stillness. "If you are certain this is your wish, then I accept with a grateful heart." The murmurs that followed were far from grateful. Alaric heard fragments of whispered conversations, words like mistake and bewitchment, and surely he jests. But he ignored them all, rising from his throne and descending the steps with measured strides. At his side, Truth-Seeker Court. The light, a reminder to all present that their king was not a man whose decisions could be questioned lightly. When he reached Lady Serenya, he extended his hand. She looked at it for a heartbeat, then placed her own smaller hand in his. Her fingers were indeed calloused from work, her nails clean but unadorned. She wore no rings, save for a simple silver band on her right hand that looked like a family heirloom of modest value. "There is one more formality," Alaric said, his voice carrying to the assembled nobles. From within his doublet he withdrew an object that made several courtiers gasp: the royal betrothal ring of Valdoria. The ring was ancient, crafted in the early days of the kingdom from gold mined in the northern mountains, and set with a stone that seemed to shift between blue and green, depending on the light. Legend held that it could only be worn by the true match of Valdoria's ruler, that it would burn the finger of anyone who tried to claim it falsely. Most dismissed this as mere superstition, a story invented to add mystique to what was simply an old piece of jewelry. Alaric had never had cause to test the legend. His first marriage had been arranged for political necessity to a princess from a neighboring kingdom, and he had given her a different ring entirely. That union had lasted 5 years before plague took her, and they had never had children. In all the years since, he had never offered the ancient ring to another. Now he held it between his fingers, the gold warm from his body heat. "Lady Serenya," he said formally, "will you accept this ring as a symbol of our betrothal and your future role as Queen of Valdoria?" She looked down at the ring, then back up at his face. Something passed between them in that moment, not love, for they barely knew each other, but a mutual recognition of commitment to whatever path they were choosing together. "I will, Your Majesty." He took her left hand and slid the ring onto her finger. The moment the gold touched her skin, the stone blazed with inner light. Not the gentle glow of reflected sunbeams, but a radiance that seemed to come from within the gem itself. The blue-green depths swirled like a miniature sea, and for an instant the entire great hall was illuminated by its brilliance. Then the light faded, leaving only a ring that seemed somehow more beautiful on her finger than it had appeared in the treasury vaults. The silence this time was absolute. Lord Marcellus, standing near the throne, looked as though someone had struck him with a mallet. Lady Cordelia's face had moved beyond pale into a sickly green that matched her emerald gown. Even Lord Ravenscroft seemed stunned by what had just occurred, though whether from joy at his daughter's elevation or shock at the ring's response was impossible to say. Alaric had expected the ring to fit her. He had good judgment about such practical matters, but he had not expected the blaze of light, the sense of rightness that seemed to settle over the hall like a benediction. Either the legends were true, or some very convenient magic had chosen this moment to manifest. "It seems," he said, his voice cutting through the silence with dry humor, "that the ancient ring approves of our match." That broke the spell. The hall erupted into noise, gasps, whispers, exclamations, and the rustle of fabric as nobles turned to their neighbors in heated discussion. Through it all, Lady Serenya stood quietly beside him, her hand still in his, the ring glowing softly on her finger like a promise. But not everyone was pleased by this development. Lady Cordelia stepped forward, her beautiful features arranged in a mask of courtly concern. "Your Majesty," she said, her musical voice pitched to carry over the noise, "surely such an important decision deserves more consideration." "Perhaps the decision is made," Alaric cut her off with the flat authority of a king who had ended debates on battlefields. "Lady Serenya will be my queen." Lord Thaddeus Meridian, Lady Cordelia's father, pressed forward with his daughter. He was a man whose wealth came from vast estates in the fertile river valleys, and his political influence matched his economic power. "Your Majesty, with respect, the kingdom has certain expectations." "The kingdom's expectations," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a tone that had made enemy generals reconsider their battle plans, "are that I choose a queen who will serve Valdoria with wisdom and dedication." "I have done so." But he could see the calculations beginning in the eyes around him. Political alliances shifted like sand dunes in a desert storm, and his choice of bride would send ripples through every power structure in the kingdom. Houses that had counted on connections through other potential queens would need to reassess their positions. Trade agreements might be reconsidered. Marriage contracts between lesser nobles could be broken or renegotiated. Most dangerous of all, those who felt slighted by his choice would begin to look for ways to express their displeasure, as if summoned. By his thoughts, Duke Aldwyn Blackmore materialized from the crowd. The Duke controlled the kingdom's southern borders, and his soldiers were among Valdoria's most experienced. He was also Lady Cordelia's cousin, a connection that had made his support for her candidacy both obvious and valuable. "Your Majesty," Duke Blackmore said with a bow that managed to be technically correct, while somehow conveying subtle disrespect, "the southern lords will be." Surprised by this development, they had understood that considerations of bloodline and political advantage would guide your choice. The threat was delicately phrased but clear enough. The southern lords had expected their preferred candidate to be chosen, and they would not be happy to discover their expectations had been disappointed. In the complex web of noble alliances that held the kingdom together, disappointed expectations could quickly become active opposition. Alaric felt Lady Serenya's hand tighten slightly in his. She understood the undercurrents as well as he did, recognized the challenges that his choice had created for both of them. But when he glanced down at her, he saw no fear in her eyes, only a quiet determination that reminded him of soldiers preparing for a difficult but necessary battle. "Duke Blackmore," he said with a smile that held no warmth, "I'm certain the Southern lords will adjust their understanding when they realize that their king has chosen his queen based on her character rather than her connections. Unless, of course, they question my judgment in such matters. The Duke's eyes flickered, a moment of calculation, as he weighed the wisdom of pushing further. In the end, political survival won over personal disappointment. Of course not, Your Majesty. I merely wished to ensure that proper preparations could be made for announcing this joyous news throughout the realm. How thoughtful. See that the preparations begin immediately. As the Duke melted back into the crowd, Alaric turned his attention to the woman whose hand he still held. Lady Serenya had watched the entire exchange with careful eyes, missing none of the subtle threats and political maneuvering that had swirled around them. When he looked at her now, she met his gaze steadily. "I hope you understand what you've accepted," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "I believe I do, Your Majesty," she replied. "The question is whether you understand what you've chosen." It was the first thing she had said that suggested depths beyond dutiful acceptance, the first hint that there might be more to Lady Serenya than even he had suspected. Before he could respond, Lord Marcellus appeared at his elbow with the careful urgency of a man trying to manage a crisis. "Your Majesty, there are arrangements to be made, announcements to prepare, ceremonies to plan, quarters to assign." Alaric nodded, recognizing the need to let the court adjust to this new reality, while he and his bride-to-be had time to understand each other better. "Lady Serenya will be given the Queen's chambers immediately. See that her belongings are moved and that she has everything she requires." The Queen's chambers. Lady Cordelia's voice rose above the murmur of conversation, sharp with disbelief. "But the betrothal has only just been announced, and as my betrothed, Lady Serenya will be accorded every honor due to a future queen," Alaric said firmly. "I trust there will be no confusion about this among the court." His gaze swept the assembled nobles, lingering just long enough on each face to make his message clear. This was not a tentative decision that could be influenced or changed. This was the will of the king, and it would be respected. The responses came in careful murmurs of agreement, but Alaric could see the storm clouds gathering. His choice had upset too many plans, disappointed too many ambitions, threatened too many assumptions about how power should be distributed. Lady Serenya would face whispers and snubs, subtle cruelties and open challenges to her worthiness. But as he looked down at the woman beside him, at the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the hostility surrounding her, at the ring that glowed softly on her finger as if it had finally found its proper home, he felt certain he had made the right choice. The kingdom was about to learn that their new queen possessed strengths that had nothing to do with beauty or bloodline, and those who underestimated her would discover their mistake soon enough. The Queen's chambers had stood empty for nearly 15 years, their elegant furnishings covered in protective cloth and their windows shuttered against the passing seasons. When the servants threw open the heavy curtains and began preparing the rooms for their new occupant, dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight like tiny spirits awakening from a long sleep. Lady Serenya stood in the center of the main chamber, turning slowly to take in the space that would soon be hers. The room was magnificent, larger than her family's entire house back in the eastern provinces. Tapestries depicting the history of Valdoria covered the walls, their threads worked in gold and silver that caught the light. The bed could have accommodated 4 people comfortably, its canopy carved with intricate patterns that must have taken craftsmen years to complete. It was beautiful, overwhelming, and utterly foreign to everything she had ever known. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" asked Margaret, the head chambermaid who had been assigned to serve her. The woman's tone was professionally neutral, but Serenya could see the curiosity in her eyes. Like everyone else in the castle, Margaret was trying to understand how the plain daughter of a minor lord had somehow captured the king's attention. "This will be fine, thank you," Serenya replied. "You've been very kind." The chambermaid's expression softened slightly at the genuine gratitude. "If you need anything at all, my lady, you have only to ring." She indicated a silk rope near the bed before curtsying and withdrawing. Alone for the first time since arriving at the castle, Serenya allowed herself to sink into one of the velvet-upholstered chairs near the fireplace. Her fingers found the simple silver locket at her throat, a habit from childhood when she needed comfort. Inside the small pendant was a pressed flower from her mother's garden, a violet that had bloomed the spring before her mother died. She had carried it for 10 years now, a reminder of simpler times when her worth hadn't been measured against the accomplishments of queens and courtesans. The weight of what had happened in the great hall was beginning to settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was to be queen, not just a wife, but the first lady of the realm, expected to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics while representing the crown with grace and wisdom. The ring on her finger, still glowing faintly in the lamplight, felt like both a promise and a burden. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting Margaret or perhaps another servant. Instead, Lady Cordelia stepped into the chamber. Even in the private setting, the woman was breathtaking. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style that framed her heart-shaped face perfectly, and her gown of sapphire silk must have cost more than most families earned in a year. In her hand she carried a mirror, not the simple polished metal that Serenya was accustomed to, but an ornate creation of silver and gold with a handle worked in precious stones. "Lady Serenya," Cordelia said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to welcome you to court personally." "Of course not. Please sit." Serenya gestured to the chair across from her, wondering what this visit was truly about. In her experience, beautiful people rarely sought out plain ones unless they wanted something. Cordelia settled gracefully into the offered seat, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance. "I must confess, your betrothal came as quite a surprise. The king has been so selective in his considerations. We all wondered what sort of exceptional woman would finally capture his heart." The words were polite on their surface, but Serenya heard the barb beneath them clearly enough. Exceptional was exactly what she wasn't, and they both knew it. "His Majesty is very kind," she replied carefully. "Oh, kind doesn't begin to describe him." Cordelia laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow managed to be entirely without warmth. "King Alaric is many things, brave, decisive, powerful, but I wonder if you truly understand the expectations that come with standing beside such a man." She held up the mirror, angling it so that Serenya could see her reflection. "The queen is not just the king's wife, you see. She's the embodiment of the kingdom's grace and beauty. She represents our finest qualities to neighboring realms, inspires our people, sets the standard for fashion and culture." Serenya looked at herself in the polished surface, her plain features, her simple dress, her hair that held no particular luster. Beside Cordelia's reflection, she looked like a sparrow next to a swan. "What do you see when you look in this mirror?" Cordelia asked softly. It was a cruel question, designed to force Serenya to acknowledge her own inadequacies. A dozen responses flickered through her mind, defensive words, angry retorts, pleas for kindness. But something in the woman's perfect features reminded her of every bully she had ever faced, every person who had dismissed her worth based solely on her appearance. "I see someone who has survived 28 years of being told she wasn't good enough," Serenya said quietly. "Someone who learned to find value in things that don't show in mirrors." Cordelia's smile faltered for just a moment. "How philosophical. But you must understand, the people need a queen they can admire, look up to. They need someone who inspires them to greatness. And you believe inspiration comes only from physical beauty?" "I believe," Cordelia said, her tone sharpening, "that queens who fail to meet their people's expectations often find their reigns challenging." The threat was delicately delivered, but unmistakable. Cordelia was warning her that the court's acceptance could not be taken for granted, that a woman who looked like Serenya would face constant challenges to her authority and worth. "I appreciate your concern," Serenya replied. surprising herself with her own steadiness. "But I suspect the king's judgment is sounder than you give him credit for." "The king's judgment in battle is unquestioned," Cordelia conceded. "But this is not a battlefield, Lady Serenya. This is court, where different weapons are used and different victories won. I would hate to see you unprepared for what awaits you." Before Serenya could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Margaret, looking slightly flustered. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but His Majesty requests your presence in his private study at your earliest convenience." "Of course. Please tell him I'll attend him directly." As Margaret withdrew, Cordelia rose gracefully from her chair. "It seems your king requires you already. How fortunate that he finds your company so engaging." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Lady Serenya, you may keep the mirror. I have others." Her smile was radiant and cold as winter moonlight. "After all, it's important to see ourselves clearly, don't you think?" Alone again, Serenya looked down at the mirror in her hands. The surface showed her face with pitiless clarity. Every unremarkable feature, every flaw that made her unsuitable for queenship in the eyes of people like Cordelia. But instead of the shame she was meant to feel, a quiet anger began to build in her chest. She had spent her entire life being told she wasn't beautiful enough, accomplished enough, interesting enough to matter. Her own family treated her betrothal as a miracle they couldn't quite believe, a stroke of fortune so unlikely that they half expected the king to change his mind at any moment. And now the court beauties like Cordelia were making it clear that they considered her elevation a mistake that would soon be corrected. But the ring on her finger still glowed with inner light, and the king had chosen her, despite every conventional reason to choose someone else. Perhaps it was time to stop accepting others' opinions of her worth as the final truth. Setting the mirror aside, Serenya rose and smoothed her simple dress. She had been summoned by her future husband, and she would not keep him waiting. Whatever Lady Cordelia and her allies were planning, whatever whispers and schemes were already beginning to swirl through the castle corridors, Serenya would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through 28 years of being underestimated. As she walked toward the door, her reflection caught the mirror's surface one more time. But instead of seeing the plain features that everyone else dismissed, she saw something different. The steady gaze of someone who had endured and survived, who had learned to find her worth in kindness rather than beauty, in strength rather than status. For the first time since arriving at the castle, Lady Serenya smiled. King Alaric's private study was a sanctuary from the formality and scrutiny of court life. Unlike the grand chambers where he held official audiences, this room felt lived in and personal. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Histories of warfare, treatises on statecraft, volumes of poetry that he read in quiet moments when the weight of kingship pressed too heavily on his shoulders. Maps covered a large table near the window, marked with colored pins that tracked trade routes, military positions, and political alliances across the known world. Serenya found him standing before one of these maps, still wearing the ceremonial doublet from the betrothal ceremony, but with his sleeves rolled up as if he had been working. Truth-seeker hung at his side, a constant reminder of the warrior beneath the royal trappings. "Your Majesty," she said softly, not wanting to interrupt his concentration. He turned at the sound of her voice, and she was struck again by the intensity of his gaze. This close, she could see the small scars that marked his face, a thin line along his jaw, a nick above his left eyebrow, each one a reminder of the battles that had shaped him into the man he had become. "Lady Serenya, please sit." He gestured to one of two comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace. "I hope you're finding your quarters suitable." "They're magnificent," she replied honestly. "Far grander than anything I'm accustomed to." A slight smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You'll grow used to it. The weight of ceremony becomes easier to bear with practice." He settled into the chair across from her, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the firelight playing across their faces. "I wanted to speak with you privately," he said finally, "before the court has time to fully process what happened today. There will be challenges ahead, Political pressures, social expectations, people who will test your resolve simply because they can. Lady Cordelia has already made that clear, Serenya said with dry humor. She was kind enough to visit me personally. Alaric's expression darkened. I see, and what wisdom did she share? That mirrors don't lie, and queens who disappoint their people often find their reigns challenging. Serenya met his eyes steadily. She gave me her mirror as a parting gift, so I could see myself clearly. And what did you see? It was a loaded question, one that could reveal whether she would crumble under the court's pressure or find the strength to stand against it. Serenya considered her words carefully. I saw someone who has spent most of her life being judged by her appearance rather than her character, she said. Someone who learned that true worth comes from what you do, not how you look doing it. Something shifted in Alaric's expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Good, because the kingdom needs a queen who understands that strength comes in many forms. He rose and walked to his desk, returning with a small wooden token, a simple medallion carved with the castle's seal. This morning, before the ceremony, I received a delegation from the castle staff. The head cook, the stable master, the chief gardener, and others. They wanted to present me with this. Serenya took the token, turning it over in her hands. The wood was smooth from handling, and the carving, while simple, had been done with obvious care. I don't understand. They heard about my choice of bride, Alaric explained. And, apparently, word had already reached them about how you had treated their people during your brief time here. Asking after a sick kitchen maid's health, thanking the stable boys for their care of your horse, speaking kindly to the servants who prepared your rooms. Heat rose in Serenya's cheeks. Those are simple courtesies, Your Majesty. Nothing remarkable. You'd be surprised how remarkable simple courtesy can be in a royal court, he said. The staff wanted me to know that they approved of my choice. They said, and I quote, that you had a true heart and would make a fine queen for common folk as well as nobles. The words touched something deep in Serenya's chest. All her life, she had tried to treat others with kindness, not because she expected anything in return, but because it felt right. To learn that these small acts had been noticed and valued gave her a sense of validation that all of Lady Cordelia's mirrors could never provide. They're good people, she said simply. Yes, they are. And their loyalty, once earned, is absolute. Alaric returned to his chair, leaning forward slightly. The great lords and ladies of the court have their own agendas, their own games to play. But the common people of this kingdom, the servants, the farmers, the craftsmen, they judge by different standards. They see through pretense to what lies beneath. Is that why you chose me? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Because you thought I might win the common people's approval? Alaric was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Partly, he said finally. A kingdom is more than just its nobles, and a queen who understands that has strength that cannot be taught or purchased. But there were other reasons as well. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the courtyard where torches were being lit against the gathering dusk. I've spent 30 years learning to read people, their motivations, their fears, their hidden strengths. It's kept me alive in situations where trusting the wrong person would have meant death. And what did you read in me? Resilience, he said without hesitation. The kind that comes from facing adversity and choosing to remain kind despite it. When I looked at your portrait, I saw someone who had been tested by life and emerged with her integrity intact. When I met you today, I saw that I was correct. Serenya felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from relief or gratitude, she couldn't say. The court will never accept me, she said quietly. I'm not what they expect in a queen. The court will accept what I tell them to accept, Alaric replied, with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded armies. But more than that, they'll come to respect you for the same reasons the castle staff already does. You simply need to give them time to see past their preconceptions. A gentle knock interrupted their conversation. Enter, Alaric called. Margaret appeared in the doorway looking apologetic. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but there's been an incident in the kitchens. Young Tom, the baker's apprentice, has taken ill quite suddenly. The cook thought perhaps Lady Serenya might know what to do, given her kindness to the staff. Serenya was already rising from her chair. What are his symptoms? Fever, difficulty breathing, a rash on his arms, Margaret replied. The castle physician is attending another matter in the village and won't return until tomorrow. Without thinking, Serenya moved toward the door. I need to see him, and I'll need access to whatever herbs and supplies the castle has available. My lady, Margaret looked confused. You have knowledge of healing? Some, Serenya said, then caught herself and looked back at Alaric. That is, if his majesty permits. Go, he said immediately. Help the boy. As they hurried through the castle corridors toward the kitchens, Margaret peppered her with questions. Where did you learn healing, my lady? Is it common knowledge among the Eastern Lord's daughters? Serenya almost smiled. My mother was skilled with herbs before she married. She taught me what she could before she died. After that, I learned from the village healer when I could. It seemed useful knowledge to have. What she didn't say was that her family had never been wealthy enough to summon physicians for every ailment, and that her plain appearance had made her an unlikely candidate for marriage, leaving her free to pursue practical skills that prettier girls might have considered beneath their station. The kitchens were in controlled chaos when they arrived. Young Tom lay on a cot that had been hastily prepared near the great hearth, his breathing labored and his skin flushed with fever. The cook, a motherly woman named Agnes, hovered nearby, wringing her hands. Oh, my lady, thank goodness you've come, Agnes said. He was fine this morning, but then he started complaining of feeling poorly, and now look at him. Serenya knelt beside the cot and placed her hand on the boy's forehead. His skin was burning hot, and when she examined the rash on his arms, she recognized the pattern immediately. Has he been working with any new ingredients today? Perhaps something imported? Aye, Agnes said. We received a shipment of spices from the southern ports this morning. Tom helped me sort through them. Red pepper, by chance? Something he hadn't handled before? Agnes's eyes widened. How did you know? Yes, we got a quantity of dried southern peppers. Tom said they made his hands tingle. Serenya nodded, relief flooding through her. This was something she could treat. He's having a reaction to the peppers. Some people are sensitive to them. The fever and breathing difficulties are his body trying to fight off what it sees as poison. She turned to Margaret. I need cold water for compresses, and if the castle has any feverfew or willow bark, bring those as well. Agnes, do you have milk? Fresh milk, not soured. For the next hour, Serenya worked steadily to treat the apprentice. She prepared compresses to bring down his fever, brewed a tea from willow bark to ease his breathing, and had him sip milk to neutralize the pepper oils still affecting his system. Gradually, his breathing eased, and his fever began to break. Word of what she was doing spread quickly through the castle. By the time Tom was resting comfortably and clearly on the mend, a small crowd had gathered in the doorway. Kitchen maids, stable hands, and even a few minor nobles who had heard about the incident. It's a miracle, Agnes whispered, tears in her eyes. You saved him, my lady. If you hadn't known what to do, anyone with knowledge of herb lore could have helped, Serenya said, uncomfortable with the praise. I'm just glad I was here when it happened. But as she looked around at the grateful faces surrounding her, she realized something important had shifted. These people no longer saw her as the plain woman who had somehow caught the king's eye. They saw her as someone who had rolled up her sleeves and used her knowledge to help one of their own. When she finally returned to the royal quarters near midnight, she found King Alaric waiting for her in the corridor outside her chambers. He was no longer in his ceremonial clothes, having changed to simple riding leathers that made him look more like a soldier than a king. How is the boy? He asked, sleeping peacefully. He should be fully recovered by morning. She paused, suddenly aware of how she must look, her dress wrinkled, her hair escaping from its pins, her hands still bearing traces of herb stains. The kitchen staff is calling you a miracle worker, Alaric said. Word has spread to the guards, the stable hands, even some of the minor nobles. By tomorrow, the entire castle will know that their future queen saved a boy's life with her own knowledge and skill. Serenya felt heat rise in her cheeks. I only did what anyone would do. No, Alaric said firmly. You did what someone with a healer's heart would do. Someone who values a kitchen boy's life as much as a lord's. He stepped closer, and in the flickering torchlight, his expression was warm with something that might have been admiration. The court may question my choice of bride, but they cannot question your worth after tonight. As he turned to go, Serenya found herself speaking. Your Majesty, thank you for trusting me to help. He paused and looked back at her. Lady Serenya, I didn't choose you despite your differences from other potential queens. I chose you because of them. Tonight proved that I was right to do so. Long after he had gone, Serenya stood in her doorway, holding the simple wooden token the castle staff had carved for their king. In one day, she had faced the court's disdain and a rival's threats. But she had also discovered that her worth was not measured by mirrors or the opinions of people like Lady Cordelia. The ring on her finger caught the lamplight, glowing softly, like a promise of better things to come. 3 weeks after the betrothal ceremony, Lady Serenya had fallen into the rhythm of castle life, though it remained as foreign to her as speaking a different language. Her days were filled with lessons in protocol from Lord Marcellus, fittings for increasingly elaborate gowns that the court insisted a future queen required, and careful navigation of social situations where every word and gesture was scrutinized for meaning. But it was in the early morning hours, before the castle fully awakened, that she found her truest purpose. The abandoned wing of the castle had once housed the royal infirmary, back in the days when kings rode to battle personally and returned home wounded. Over the decades of relative peace, the medical facilities had been moved to a smaller, more convenient location near the main courtyard, leaving the old infirmary rooms empty and forgotten. Serenya discovered them by accident while exploring the castle's labyrinthine corridors, seeking quiet places where she could escape the constant scrutiny of court life. What she found horrified her. 23 soldiers lay on makeshift bedding in the dim, dusty chambers, men who had been wounded in recent skirmishes along the kingdom's borders and deemed too severely injured to return to active duty, but not important enough to warrant space in the main infirmary. Some suffered from infected wounds that had never properly healed. Others bore the trembling signs of battle shock, their minds broken by memories of violence they could not escape. They were forgotten men, fed basic rations and given minimal care while they waited to either recover enough to return to service or die quietly out of sight. Serenya's herb pouch, a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her mother, became her most treasured possession. Each morning, she slipped away to tend these neglected soldiers, cleaning wounds with solutions brewed from plants she gathered in the castle's kitchen garden, preparing tinctures to ease pain, and most importantly, listening to their stories with the patience of someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked. Sergeant Marcus Greystone was the first to trust her completely. A veteran of 15 years' service, he had taken a sword thrust to the leg during a border raid that left him with a wound that refused to heal properly. The castle's physicians had declared him beyond their help, useful only as a cautionary example to younger soldiers about the prices of warfare. You shouldn't be here. My lady, he said the first morning she knelt beside his pallet with fresh bandages and a jar of honey-based salve. This isn't a place for someone like you. Someone like me? Serenya asked, carefully examining the angry red flesh around his wound. A lady. Someone important. Someone who has better things to do than tend to broken soldiers. She looked up at him, really looked, seeing past the unkempt beard and hollow cheeks to the pride that kept him upright despite his pain. Sergeant Greystone, what do you think is more important than ensuring that men who bled for this kingdom receive proper care? He had no answer for that, and by the time she finished cleaning his wound and applying fresh dressing infused with herbs that would fight infection, the suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by cautious hope. Word spread quickly among the forgotten soldiers. The king's bride-to-be was coming to see them, bringing medicines that actually helped, treating them as if their service mattered. Within a week, men who had been silent for months were sharing stories of their campaigns. their families, their dreams of what they might do if they ever healed enough to leave the abandoned wing. But Serenya's work in the old infirmary did not go unnoticed by everyone. Lord Physician Alaric, the castle's chief medical officer, was a man who took great pride in his university education and his position as the kingdom's foremost authority on healing. When reports reached him that the king's betrothed was practicing medicine without training or permission, he was both offended and alarmed. "Your Majesty," he said during his weekly audience with King Alaric, "I must respectfully raise a concern about Lady Serenya's activities." Alaric looked up from the military reports he had been reviewing. "What activities?" "She has been treating wounded soldiers in the old infirmary wing, using herbs and remedies without proper medical knowledge. I fear she may do more harm than good, despite her noble intentions. Have any of her patients complained about her treatment?" Lord Physician Alaric shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, Your Majesty. In fact, several men have shown remarkable improvement. But that is beside the point. Medical practice should be left to those with proper training." "Show me," Alaric said, rising from his chair. "I want to see this infirmary you speak of." 20 minutes later, the king stood in the doorway of the old medical wing, surveying a scene that filled him with both admiration and anger. The rooms had been transformed from dusty storage areas into functional healing spaces. Beds that had been nothing more than straw pallets now had clean linens. Windows that had been shuttered for years had been opened to let in light and fresh air. Most remarkably, the soldiers who had been left to languish in despair were sitting up, talking to one another, some even attempting simple exercises to rebuild their strength. At the center of it all was Serenya, kneeling beside a young man whose arm hung at an unnatural angle. She was speaking to him in low, encouraging tones, while gently manipulating the limb to assess the damage. "The bone has knitted poorly," she was saying. "But if we're careful and work slowly, we might be able to improve your range of motion. It will require patience and daily exercises." The soldier nodded eagerly. "Yes, my lady. Whatever you think best." Alaric watched as she demonstrated the exercises, her hands gentle but firm, as she guided the young man through movements designed to restore function to the damaged joint. There was nothing of the squeamish court lady about her. She worked with the focused competence of someone who understood that healing required both knowledge and compassion. "Your Majesty." Sergeant Greystone spotted the king first and struggled to sit up straighter despite his injuries. "We weren't expecting, that is, we don't usually receive." "At ease, Sergeant," Alaric said quietly. "I came to see how you men were faring." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. These soldiers knew they had been forgotten, relegated to the margins of the kingdom's concern because their injuries made them inconvenient reminders of warfare's true costs. They expected nothing from their king but the most basic provisions needed to keep them alive. "Lady Serenya has been most kind to us, Your Majesty," another soldier ventured. "She's helped more than we had any right to expect." "Has she indeed?" Alaric's gaze moved to his betrothed, who had gone still at the sound of his voice. "And what manner of help has she provided?" "Proper medicines, sire. Clean dressings. Someone who listens when we speak of our service." Greystone's voice carried the rough emotion of a man not accustomed to gratitude. "She's given us hope that we might yet be useful to the kingdom." Alaric walked slowly through the improvised infirmary, taking in details that spoke of systematic organization and genuine care. Herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams. Medical supplies were arranged with military precision. Charts tracked each patient's progress in handwriting he recognized as Serenya's. "Lord Physician," he said without turning around, "how many men currently occupy this wing?" 23, Your Majesty, though I fail to see. "And how many have you examined in the past month?" The uncomfortable silence answered his question. "Lady Serenya," Alaric said, finally addressing her directly, "might I have a word with you privately?" She rose from beside her patient, her simple dress wrinkled from kneeling on stone floors, her hands bearing the inevitable stains that came from preparing medicines. "Of course, Your Majesty." They walked to a small alcove that had once served as a consultation room for the castle's physicians. When they were alone, Alaric turned to study her face. She met his gaze steadily, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. 3 weeks, Your Majesty. Since the morning after I helped Tom in the kitchens, and you didn't think to inform me that you were establishing a medical practice in my castle." For the first time since he had known her, Serenya's composure wavered. "I meant no disrespect, Your Majesty. These men were suffering, and I had knowledge that could help them. I didn't consider that permission was required to offer aid to those in need." It was exactly the answer he had hoped for and feared. Hoped because it confirmed that her compassion was genuine and instinctive. Feared because it revealed how much she still didn't understand about the political implications of her actions. "Do you have any idea what you've accomplished here?" he asked. She looked confused. "I've treated some wounds and provided comfort to soldiers who were being neglected. Nothing more than basic charity. You've done something that the kingdom failed to do," he said quietly. "You saw men who had served their country faithfully, and you ensured they received the care they deserved. You've given them back their dignity along with their health." The relief that flooded her features was followed quickly by understanding. "The court won't approve of this, will they?" "Some will object on principle. They'll say it's unseemly for a future queen to work with her hands, to associate so closely with common soldiers. Others will claim you're overstepping your authority by practicing medicine without formal training. And what do you say, Your Majesty?" Alaric looked back toward the main room where the soldiers waited, many of them showing signs of healing that hadn't been present when he'd last reviewed their cases months ago. "I say that a queen who cares more about her people's welfare than her own reputation is exactly what this kingdom needs." He paused, then added, "But from now on you'll have Lord Physician Aldrich's full cooperation and whatever supplies you require. If you're going to heal people, you'll do it with the Crown's official support." The smile that spread across Serenya's face was radiant, transforming her plain features into something approaching beauty. In that moment, Alaric understood something that had been growing in his mind. Since their betrothal, his respect for this remarkable woman was deepening into something far more profound. The discovery of the ancient Omega Chronicles happened entirely by accident, though later Serenya would wonder if some force beyond chance had guided her steps that evening. She'd been returning from the infirmary later than usual, having spent extra time with a soldier whose wounds had become infected despite her care. The castle corridors were dimly lit by widely spaced torches, and in her fatigue, she took a wrong turn in the maze of passages that connected the various wings. Instead of emerging near her chambers, she found herself in a section of the castle she had never seen before, older than the rest, with stone walls that showed the marks of ancient craftsmanship. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, as if weighted with centuries of accumulated history. Following a narrow staircase that curved upward into darkness, she emerged in what had once been a library. Dust covered everything like a grey shroud, and spiderwebs draped the tall shelves like abandoned tapestries. Most of the books appeared to be records of long-dead kings and forgotten court proceedings, their leather bindings cracked with age. But one volume drew her attention immediately. It sat apart from the others, on a reading table near a window, as if someone had left it there recently, though the dust patterns suggested no one had visited this room in decades. The book was bound in midnight blue leather that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and when Serenya touched the cover, she felt a strange tingling in her fingers. The title, worked in silver letters that had not tarnished despite their age, read, "Chronicles of the Omega Queens, a true history of the lost bloodlines." Her heart began to race even before she opened the book. Omega, the term applied to those rare individuals who possessed healing abilities beyond normal human capacity, who could sense the emotions and needs of others with supernatural clarity. Most people dismiss such individuals as myths, stories told to children about magical times that never truly existed. But as Serenya carefully turned the ancient pages, she found detailed accounts of women who had ruled kingdoms across the known world, all possessing abilities that sounded remarkably similar to the strange experiences she had been having lately. Queen Lysandra the Healer, who could cure plagues with a touch, and died defending her people from invasion 300 years ago. Queen Morwen the Truthseer, whose ability to sense deception made her the most feared negotiator of her age. Queen Elena the Heartmender, who could ease psychological wounds as easily as physical ones, all of them Omegas. All of them possessing gifts that manifested during times of great stress or emotional connections. Serenya's hands trembled as she read descriptions of abilities that explained so much about her own recent experiences. The way she could sense exactly what each wounded soldier needed before examining them. The instinctive knowledge that had guided her treatment of young Tom's pepper reaction. The strange dreams that had begun plaguing her sleep, visions of battles and courts, and women who looked remarkably like older versions of herself. According to the chronicles, the Omega bloodlines had been deliberately obscured over generations, hidden away to protect their descendants from those who would exploit or destroy such gifts. Many Omega children grew up never knowing their heritage, their abilities dismissed as unusual intuition or simple intelligence, but the bloodlines persisted, waiting for times when their gifts were most needed. A sound in the corridor below made her close the book hastily. Footsteps were approaching, measured, purposeful, bearing the rhythm of someone accustomed to authority. She recognized King Alaric's gait even before she heard his voice calling her name. Lady Serenya. Margaret said you hadn't returned to your chambers. I'm here, Your Majesty, she called back, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. I became lost and found this old library. His footsteps climbed the narrow stairs, and moments later he appeared in the doorway, a torch in his hand casting dancing shadows across the ancient room. This hasn't been used in decades, he said, looking around with interest. What drew you up here? She gestured vaguely at the shelves. Curiosity, I suppose. I've always enjoyed reading, and I wondered what histories might be preserved here. Alaric stepped closer, his torch illuminating the reading table where the chronicles lay. His expression grew thoughtful as he read the title, though he made no comment about the book itself. Find anything interesting? He asked. Stories, she said carefully. Old legends about queens who possessed unusual abilities. Ah, the Omega Chronicles. His tone was neutral, but something in his eyes suggested the book was not entirely unknown to him. My grandfather mentioned that volume once. He said it contained more truth than most people would find comfortable. You've read it? Parts of it. Enough to understand why it's kept in a library that most people never find. He set his torch in a wall sconce and moved to stand beside her. The question is, what do you make of what you've read? It was a test, she realized. He was giving her the opportunity to dismiss the book as fantasy, to distance herself from implications that could change everything about how she understood herself and her place in the world. Instead, she found herself speaking with an honesty that surprised them both. I think, she said slowly, that there are more ways to heal than most physicians understand, and that some people are born with gifts that others might call impossible, including you. The question hung in the air between them like a bridge that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Serenya thought about the soldiers whose conditions had improved far more rapidly under her care than medical knowledge should have allowed. She thought about the instinctive certainty she felt when treating injuries, as if some part of her mind could see exactly what was needed. She thought about the dreams that felt more like memories, and the way her touch seemed to bring comfort that went beyond the physical. I don't know, she said finally, but lately I've been experiencing things that I can't fully explain. Alaric nodded slowly. The ring that blazed when I placed it on your finger was forged by the same craftsman who made Queen Lysandra's crown. It was designed to respond to Omega blood. The revelation struck her like lightning. You knew? When you chose me, you knew what I might be? I suspected, Your healing abilities, your intuitive understanding of what people need, the way you inspire loyalty without effort, these are all traits associated with the old bloodlines." He paused, studying her face carefully. "But suspecting and knowing are different things. The choice had to be yours. What choice? Whether to explore these gifts or to ignore them. Whether to become the queen your bloodline suggests you could be, or to remain the woman everyone expects you to be." Serenya looked down at the chronicles, their pages filled with stories of women who had changed the course of history through abilities that defied conventional understanding. Then she looked at her hands, plain, work-worn hands that nonetheless seemed to possess a healing touch that went beyond her training. "The court already questions my worthiness," she said quietly. "If they believed I possessed supernatural abilities, some would fear you," Alaric agreed. "Others would try to use you. But many would finally understand why their king chose you above all others. And you, your majesty, do you fear what I might become?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth she had never heard before. "Lady Serenya, I have spent my life surrounded by people who excel at appearing to be what they are not. Courtiers who smile while plotting betrayal. Allies who offer friendship while calculating advantage. Advisors who speak wisdom while pursuing their own interests." He reached out and gently touched the chronicles, his fingers brushing against hers. "If you truly possess the gifts these pages describe, then you are exactly what this kingdom needs, someone whose power comes from genuine care for others, whose strength is rooted in compassion rather than ambition." The contact between their hands sent warmth shooting up her arm, and for an instant she felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of deep connection, as if she could perceive not just his words, but the emotions behind them. She sensed his loneliness, carried like armor beneath his royal bearing, his genuine concern for the kingdom's welfare, which drove him to make difficult decisions without regard for personal cost. And beneath it all, a growing affection for her that had nothing to do with political necessity. The connection lasted only a moment before she pulled her hand back, overwhelmed by the intensity of what she had felt. But in that brief contact, she understood that whatever gifts she might possess, they were already beginning to manifest in ways she couldn't control. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice slightly breathless, "I think the choice may already be made for me." He smiled, an expression she was learning to treasure for its rarity. "Then perhaps it's time to discover what you're truly capable of." As they prepared to leave the ancient library, Serenya carefully tucked the chronicles under her arm. The book seemed to pulse with warmth against her side, as if recognizing that it had finally found its way to the person meant to read it. Behind them, the dusty library settled back into silence, but something fundamental had changed. The future queen of Valdoria had begun to understand that her true inheritance had nothing to do with noble blood or political alliances, and everything to do with gifts that could reshape the very nature of what it meant to rule. The ring on her finger glowed more brightly than ever as they descended the stairs, its light reflecting off the stone walls like a promise of power yet to be fully awakened. The attack came at dawn, when the castle's defenses were at their most vulnerable, and the changing of the guard created brief moments of inattention that experienced raiders knew how to exploit. Serenya woke to the sound of steel and shouting voices that carried the unmistakable tone of battle. Through her chamber window, she could see smoke rising from the outer courtyard, and figures in dark armor moving with the coordinated purpose of a well-planned assault. She had barely managed to pull a robe over her nightgown when Margaret burst through the door, her face pale with terror. "My lady, you must come quickly. His Majesty commands that you be taken to the safe room immediately." "What's happening?" "Raiders, my lady. They've breached the outer walls. The king has gone to rally the defenders, but he wants you protected." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside, followed by a crash that shook the entire floor. Whatever was happening in the castle's outer defenses The fighting had reached the royal quarters. "This way, my lady," Margaret urged, leading her toward a concealed door that Serenya had never noticed before. "The safe room is through here. You'll be protected until the danger passes." But as they hurried through the hidden passages that honeycombed the castle's inner structure, Serenya found herself thinking not of her own safety, but of the wounded soldiers in the abandoned wing. If raiders had penetrated this far into the castle, those men, weakened by injuries and unable to flee, would be defenseless targets. "Margaret, what about the soldiers in the old infirmary?" "My lady, I'm sure the king's men will—" "No." Serenya stopped walking, decision crystallizing in her mind with sudden clarity. "Take me to them now." "My lady," the king ordered. "The king ordered that I be kept safe. But those men served this kingdom faithfully, and I won't abandon them to save myself." Margaret's protest was cut short by another explosion, this one close enough to rain dust from the stone ceiling. In the distance, they could hear the unmistakable sound of armed men moving through the castle's corridors, their boots ringing on stone as they searched for whatever prize had motivated this dangerous raid. "Very well, my lady." But quickly, they reached the old infirmary to find it in chaos. Several of the more mobile soldiers had barricaded the main entrance with overturned beds and medical supplies, while the others, those too injured to fight, huddled in the back rooms. Sergeant Greystone, despite his wounded leg, had armed himself with a sword and was attempting to organize a defense with men who were barely able to stand. "Lady Serenya," he called when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." "Where else should I be when my people are threatened?" she replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "What do you need?" "Weapons, mainly, and some way to get the worst wounded out of here before those bastards break through our barricade." As if summoned by his words, the sound of heavy impacts began echoing from the main door. The raiders had found them and were attempting to break through the improvised defenses. Serenya looked around the room, at men who had served their kingdom with honor, now facing death because they were too injured to flee or fight effectively. Something hot and fierce began building in her chest, a protective anger unlike anything she had ever experienced. "Stand away from the barricade," she said quietly. "My lady, stand away." Her voice carried an authority that made the soldiers obey without question, even though they clearly thought she had lost her mind. Serenya approached the barricaded door, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. She could hear voices on the other side, rough foreign accents discussing the best way to break through. One of them mentioned something about finding the Omega and taking her alive, words that sent ice through her veins. They hadn't come to raid the castle. They had come for her. The realization triggered something deep within her, a power that had been building since she first read the Chronicles. The ring on her finger blazed with sudden light, casting dancing shadows on the walls as energy she didn't understand coursed through her body. She pressed her palms against the barricaded door and felt the wood and stone respond to her touch. Not with heat or force, but with something more fundamental, a connection to the very essence of the materials, as if she could perceive their molecular structure and manipulate it at will. The heavy oak door, which had stood for centuries, began to change. Its grain shifted and flowed like water, the wood becoming denser, harder, more resilient than any earthly material. The stone doorframe fused with the transformed wood, creating a barrier that would require magical force rather than conventional weapons to breach. The hammering from the other side continued for several more minutes before finally stopping. Confused voices discussed this development in a language Serenya didn't recognize, though their tone suggested they understood that conventional methods would no longer suffice. Behind her, the wounded soldiers stared in awed silence. "My lady," Sergeant Greystone whispered, "what did you just do?" Before she could answer, another voice cut through the air, familiar, cold, and speaking from the direction of the infirmary's rear entrance. "Something that confirms she's exactly what we came for." Serenya turned to see Lady Cordelia standing in the doorway. But this was not the elegant court beauty she knew. This woman wore dark leather armor that fit her like a second skin, and in her hands she carried weapons that gleamed with more than reflected light. Her golden hair was braided for battle, and her perfect features were set in lines of grim determination. "You," Serenya breathed. "You're with them." "Not with them," Cordelia corrected, stepping fully into the room followed by a dozen armed figures in the same dark armor the soldiers had seen outside. "Leading them." This entire raid was planned around one objective, confirming what the ancient bloodlines truly mean, and taking you somewhere that your gifts can be properly appreciated. Sergeant Greystone raised his sword despite his wounded leg, but one of Cordelia's companions, a man whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the air, gestured casually, and the blade flew from the sergeant's grasp to clatter against the stone. "Wall sorcerers," Greystone spat. "I should have known. Not sorcerers," Cordelia said with a smile that held no warmth. "Alphas. The natural counterparts to Omega power, though far more willing to use force to achieve our goals." Serenya felt the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "The neighboring kingdoms that questioned Alaric's choice, they sent you. They hired me, yes. Though I confess, my motivations became personal when our dear king chose you over me." Cordelia's voice carried the bite of winter frost. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to be passed over for someone so unremarkable? So you decided to prove your worth through betrayal and murder." "I decided to claim what should have been mine from the beginning." Cordelia stepped closer, and Serenya could feel power radiating from her. Not the warm, healing energy that flowed through her own veins, but something colder and more aggressive. "But first, you're going to demonstrate exactly why those ancient bloodlines were hidden away." One of the wounded soldiers, a young man named Peter, whose arm Serenya had been treating, cried out in sudden pain. His healing wounds split open, blood flowing freely, as if her careful work over the past weeks had never happened. "Stop it!" Serenya demanded, moving toward the injured man. "Make me," Cordelia replied. Another soldier gasped as his carefully mended ribs seemed to crack anew. The fury that rose in Serenya was like nothing she had ever experienced. These men had bled for their kingdom, had been abandoned and forgotten until she found them. And now this woman was undoing their healing for the simple pleasure of causing pain. The ring on her finger didn't just glow, it blazed like a miniature sun. Power flowed through her with such intensity that she could feel it changing her at a fundamental level, awakening abilities that had lain dormant in her bloodline for generations. She reached toward Peter, not touching him, but extending her awareness in ways she was only beginning to understand. The wounds that Cordelia's power had reopened began to seal themselves, but more than that, they healed completely, leaving not even scars behind. The young soldier's arm, which had been weakened by old fractures, became stronger than it had ever been. "Fascinating," Cordelia murmured, but her eyes showed more hunger than admiration. "The stories are true, then? Pure Omega bloodline, awakened by emotional extremists." She gestured to her companions, and several of them moved to surround the wounded soldiers. "Let's see how far your protective instincts will take you. Heal one, and I'll wound 3 others. Save them all, and I'll begin killing them. What do you want?" Serenya asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I want you to come with me willingly. My employers have need of an Omega's abilities, and they're prepared to offer you luxuries and comforts beyond anything this drafty castle could provide. Refuse, and everyone in this room dies slowly while you watch." The soldiers shifted restlessly, their loyalty to her warring with their understanding of the hopeless situation. They were wounded, outnumbered, and facing opponents whose abilities they didn't understand. But Serenya was no longer the uncertain woman who had arrived at court 6 weeks ago. She was awakening to powers that connected her to something ancient and profound, and she felt the presence of every Omega queen who had come before her, lending strength to her resolve. "I have a different proposal," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made even Cordelia pause. "You and your allies leave my castle immediately. And I won't demonstrate exactly what an awakened Omega is capable of when protecting those she cares about." Cordelia laughed, though the sound held less confidence than before. "You've read too many stories, dear. The chronicles are full of legends about Omega queens who could level armies and remake kingdoms, but you're one woman facing trained killers. Am I?" Serenya extended her awareness beyond the confines of the infirmary, feeling the life force of every person in the castle. King Alaric was in the Great Hall, fighting desperately against odds that suggested the raid had been far better planned than anyone had expected. The castle's defenders were scattered and confused, unable to coordinate an effective response against attackers who seemed to know the building's layout intimately. But beneath her feet, in the foundations of the ancient castle, something else waited. Power that had been laid into the very stones centuries ago by craftsmen who understood that some buildings needed to be more than mere structures. This castle was built by King Baldwin I, she said conversationally, who married Queen Lysandra of the Omega bloodline. "Did you really think they wouldn't leave protections for their descendants?" She placed her palm against the stone wall and immediately felt the connection snap into place. The castle itself became an extension of her will, its centuries of accumulated strength flowing into her consciousness like water filling an empty vessel. Through the stone, she could sense every person within the walls, friends and enemies alike. Through the ancient foundations, she could draw upon power that had been waiting 300 years for an Omega touch to awaken it. "Last chance," she said to Cordelia, whose perfect features were beginning to show the first hints of uncertainty. "Leave now, or face the consequences of threatening what is under my protection." Instead of answering, Cordelia raised her hand and sent a lance of crackling energy toward the nearest wounded soldier. The power never reached its target. It struck an invisible barrier that blazed with silver light, dissipating harmlessly as Serenya's protective instincts merged with abilities she was only beginning to comprehend. "So be it," she said quietly. What happened next would be spoken of in whispers for generations. The castle itself seemed to come alive, its stones shifting to trap the invaders while leaving Serenya's people unharmed. Corridors rearranged themselves to confuse and separate Cordelia's forces. Doors sealed themselves against enemies while opening freely for defenders. And through it all, Serenya stood at the center of the transformation, no longer the plain woman who had been mocked by the court, but revealed as the true inheritor of powers that had shaped kingdoms. The lost crown of Lysandra, which had sat in the castle's treasury for 3 centuries, began to glow in response to the awakening power. Though rooms away, Serenya could feel it calling to her, recognizing the bloodline it had been created to serve, when the ancient crown materialized on her, head drawn by magic that transcended physical barriers. Even Cordelia's alpha arrogance, cracked. "Impossible," she breathed, staring at the woman who now blazed with the accumulated power of her royal heritage. "The bloodlines were supposed to be broken, hidden," Serenya corrected, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through stone and bone alike. "Not broken, and now awakened at the moment they're needed most." The battle for the castle's soul was about to begin, but it would be fought between powers that the modern world had forgotten existed, and Serenya was no longer just a bride, chosen for her kindness, but a queen prepared to defend her people with abilities that defied every convention of royal power. The revelation of Serenya's true nature sent shockwaves through the castle that extended far beyond the immediate confrontation with Cordelia's forces. Word spread with supernatural speed, aided perhaps by the castle's awakened consciousness that their future queen possessed abilities that connected her to the legendary Omega bloodlines. In the Great Hall, King Alaric felt the change like a physical blow. The ancient stones around him hummed with energy he hadn't experienced since childhood stories told by his grandfather about the old queens and their mystical powers. The very air seemed to thicken with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Your Majesty," Lord Marcellus gasped, pointing toward the high windows where silver light danced like aurora across the glass. "What in heaven's name is happening?" Before Alaric could answer, a dozen of Cordelia's raiders burst through the hall's main entrance, their weapons gleaming with the unnatural light that marked alpha-forged steel. But instead of the confident advance of professional soldiers, they moved with the desperate haste of men who had discovered their mission had become something far more complex than anticipated. "Where is she?" their leader demanded, his accent marking him as coming from the northern territories where rumors spoke of kingdoms ruled by those who claimed descent from legendary bloodlines. "Where is the Omega?" "You'll find no one here but soldiers loyal to their king," Alaric replied, Truthseeker singing as he drew it from its sheath. The sword's steel seemed to drink in the strange silver light, its edge becoming sharper and more deadly than any earthly metallurgy could explain. "King Alaric." The raider's voice carried a mocking tone. "Do you have any idea what you've harbored in your castle? What you've awakened by choosing that plain little bride?" "I know," Alaric said quietly, "that I chose a woman whose worth you clearly cannot comprehend. The battle that followed was unlike any the Great Hall had witnessed in 3 centuries. These were not ordinary brigands seeking treasure or political advantage. They were alpha warriors, trained from birth to hunt and capture those with Omega abilities. Their weapons designed to counter powers that defied natural law. But Alaric was no ordinary king. His reputation as a warrior had been earned through decades of combat against enemies both conventional and supernatural. And Truthseeker had been forged by the same craftsman who had made Queen Lysandra's crown. As the raiders pressed their attack, the ancient blade began to exhibit properties that transcended mere steel, parrying strikes that should have shattered it, and landing cuts that bit deeper than physics should have allowed. Meanwhile, throughout the castle, the systematic hunt for Omega power continued. Cordelia's forces moved with military precision, sealing off escape routes while searching for their primary target. They had planned this raid for months, studying the castle's layout, identifying its weaknesses, and positioning themselves to exploit the kingdom's moment of greatest vulnerability. But they hadn't planned for the castle itself to become their enemy. Corridors that should have led to the royal quarters instead opened onto storage rooms. Staircases that had been solid stone for centuries suddenly became treacherous, their steps shifting to trip unwary feet. Doors that had been unlocked moments before now refused to open, while others that had been barred for years swung wide to create new paths for the castle's defenders. In the war room, where maps marked with colored pins showed the disposition of Valdoria's military forces, Duke Blackmore and his allies watched the silver light dancing across the ancient stones with expressions of growing alarm. "This changes everything," the Duke muttered, his political calculations shifting with each pulse of otherworldly energy. "If she truly possesses Omega abilities, then our kingdoms face a threat unlike any in recorded history," finished Lord Thaddeus Meridian, Lady Cordelia's father. "The old stories speak of Omega queens who could command the loyalty of armies, heal plagues with a touch, and reshape the very landscape to serve their will. Stories," Duke Blackmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Legends told to children, are they?" Lord Meridian gestured toward the windows, where the silver radiance was growing brighter by the moment. "Because it appears those children's stories are manifesting in reality." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Henrik, commander of the Southern Border Forces and one of Duke Blackmore's most trusted officers. The man's armor bore fresh dents and scorch marks, and his expression suggested he had witnessed things that challenged his understanding of the possible. "My lords," he said, sketching a hurried bow, "I bring word from the outer defenses." "Speak," Duke Blackmore commanded. "The raiders aren't just trying to capture Lady Serenya, sir. They're trying to prevent her from reaching full power. Their leader, a woman calling herself Alpha Prime, she's been giving orders about containing the awakening before it can spread beyond the castle grounds." "Spread how?" Lord Meridian asked, According to their communications, which we've been monitoring, Omega power can awaken others of the bloodline through proximity and emotional resonance. If Lady Serenya reaches her full potential while surrounded by people who care about her, she could trigger a cascade effect that awakens every dormant Omega bloodline in the kingdom. The implications struck both men with the force of lightning. A kingdom filled with individuals possessing supernatural abilities would fundamentally alter the balance of power that had governed international relations for centuries. Traditional warfare would become obsolete. Diplomacy would need to account for rulers who could sense deception and compel truth. The very foundations of how kingdoms interacted would require complete rethinking. How many bloodlines are we talking about? Duke Blackmore asked quietly. According to the Raiders' intelligence, potentially hundreds. The Omega lines were never truly eliminated. They were hidden, scattered, and suppressed. But if the right catalyst appears, then Valdoria becomes the most powerful kingdom in known history, Lord Meridian finished, and every other realm becomes a potential vassal state. Both men looked toward the silver light that continued to intensify beyond the windows, their political loyalties warring with pragmatic recognition of changing realities. They had supported Cordelia's candidacy because they believed it would strengthen their own positions. Now they faced the possibility that their future queen possessed abilities that could render their scheming irrelevant. In the abandoned infirmary, Serenya felt the weight of these developing conflicts pressing against her consciousness. Through her connection to the castle, she could sense the various groups of people, friends and enemies alike, whose lives hung in the balance of decisions. She was only beginning to understand how to make the wounded soldiers looked to her with expressions of awe and absolute trust. Sergeant Greystone, his leg miraculously healed by her unconscious use of power, stood ready to follow her orders without question. These men had accepted her worth long before supernatural abilities entered the equation, and their loyalty remained unchanged by revelations that should have terrified them. Cordelia's forces, meanwhile, pressed their advantage with the desperate intensity of people who understood that failure meant facing the consequences of having attacked a power they were not equipped to contain. Their alpha abilities allowed them to counter some Omega gifts, but raw power meant nothing against an awakened queen who drew strength from an entire castle, and everyone within it who wished her well. "You cannot hold them all," Cordelia said, her perfect features marred by frustration and growing concern. "Alpha training teaches us to exploit Omega weaknesses, your compulsion to protect others, your inability to cause harm without emotional cost. Save these soldiers, and I'll move against the kitchen staff. Protect the servants, and I'll threaten the stable boys." "You're assuming," Serenya replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the stone itself, "that I'm still bound by the limitations you expect." She extended her awareness throughout the castle, feeling the life force of everyone within its walls. Not just humans. She could sense the horses in the stables, the hunting dogs in their kennels, even the mice in the walls and birds in the eaves. All of it connected, all of it under her protection, now that she had accepted responsibility for their welfare. Through the ancient foundations, power flowed into her from sources she was only beginning to understand. Queen Lysandra's crown blazed on her head like a beacon, connecting her to the memories and abilities of every Omega queen who had worn it. The ring on her finger pulsed in harmony with the crown, creating a circuit of power that grew stronger with each heartbeat. But most importantly, she could feel King Alaric fighting for his life in the Great Hall, outnumbered by enemies whose weapons were designed to kill those he cared about most, her husband-to-be, the man who had seen worth in her when no one else could. The king who had given her the freedom to discover abilities that might have remained forever dormant without his trust and support. "Choose," Cordelia demanded, raising power that crackled with alpha energy. "Save your wounded soldiers or your precious king. You cannot protect them all." Serenya's smile was radiant and terrible as the full scope of her awakened abilities crystallized in her mind. "Watch me," The lost crown of Lysandra blazed with light that made the silver radiance of moments before seem dim by comparison. Through every stone in the ancient castle, through every person who had ever shown her kindness, through the very land that Valdoria's rulers had sworn to protect, power flowed into the woman who had been chosen for her character and discovered her supernatural heritage in the crucible of genuine love and loyalty. The battle for the kingdom's soul was about to be decided not by armies or political maneuvering, but by the awakened power of a queen who had learned to value people over appearances, substance over surface, and love over all the glittering temptations that power could offer. And in the great hall, as Truth-Seeker sang through the air in King Alaric's experienced hands, he felt the change in the very air around him, the presence of power vast and protective, wielded by someone whose first instinct was to heal rather than harm, to protect rather than conquer. His bride was coming to save him, bringing with her abilities that would reshape not just the battle, but the very nature of what it meant to rule with wisdom and strength. The battle horn of unity had hung in the great hall for 3 centuries, its brass surface tarnished by age and neglect. Legend claimed it had been crafted by Queen Lysandra herself, imbued with the power to rally all loyal hearts when blown by one of true royal blood. Most dismissed it as another pretty story from an age when people believed in magic, until Serenya's power reached through stone and distance to call it to her hand. The horn materialized in the abandoned infirmary like a shaft of golden light, its weight familiar in her grasp, though she had never touched it before. The moment her fingers closed around its surface, memories that belonged to other queens flooded her consciousness. Battles fought and won, people saved, kingdoms protected by those who understood that true power came from serving others rather than ruling them. Impossible, Cordelia breathed, her alpha confidence finally cracking as she recognized artifacts of power that her kind had spent centuries trying to destroy or corrupt. The royal treasures only answer to their rightful wielders, Serenya finished, raising the horn to her lips, which I apparently am. The note that emerged when she blew the ancient instrument was unlike any sound the castle had heard in generations. It rang through stone and timber with supernatural clarity, carrying harmonics that touched the very soul of everyone who heard it. But more than sound, it conveyed meaning, a call to arms that spoke directly to the hearts of those who served the kingdom with genuine loyalty. In the great hall, King Alaric felt the horn's call like fire in his veins. The exhaustion of fighting against overwhelming odds fell away, replaced by strength that seemed to flow from the stones themselves. Truth-Seeker blazed in his hands with inner light, its edge becoming sharp enough to cut through the enchanted weapons of his enemies as if they were made of paper. Throughout the castle, the horn's call reached every person who had shown Serenya kindness during her brief time among them. Kitchen maids found courage they didn't know they possessed. Stable boys armed themselves with pitchforks and moved to defend their castle. Even the wounded soldiers in the infirmary felt their injuries heal with supernatural speed, their bodies restored by the power flowing through their queen's voice. But the horn's true magic lay not in granting strength, but in revealing truth. As its golden notes echoed through the corridors, every person within the castle's walls felt their deepest loyalties laid bare. Those who truly served the kingdom found themselves filled with purpose and power beyond their natural abilities. Those who harbored treacherous thoughts or selfish ambitions found the horn's call painful to bear, its pure tones exposing the corruption in their hearts. In the war room, Duke Blackmore clutched his chest as if struck by a physical blow. The horn's call revealed his true nature, not a loyal duke concerned with the kingdom's welfare, but an ambitious man whose support had always been conditional on personal advantage. The sound was agony to him, its purity a constant reminder of how far he had strayed from genuine service. Lord Meridian fared no better. His political schemes and careful manipulations felt exposed and shameful in the face of power that recognized only authentic loyalty. Both men found themselves paralyzed by the horn's truth-telling properties, unable to take action in support of either side. But for Captain Henrik and the castle's genuine defenders, the horn's call was like hearing the voice of righteousness itself. Their weapons grew lighter in their hands, their aim became true, and their hearts filled with unshakable determination to protect those they served. The effect on Cordelia's alpha forces was immediate and devastating. The horn's pure tones caused them physical pain, its harmonics disrupting the darker energies they drew upon for their supernatural abilities. Several of the weaker ones collapsed entirely, while even Cordelia herself staggered under the assault of sound that revealed the corruption at the core of alpha power. "You don't understand what you're doing," Cordelia gasped. Her perfect features twisted with pain as the horn's call continued to resonate through the castle. Alpha and Omega abilities exist in balance. You cannot simply eradicate one without consequences. "I'm not trying to eradicate anything," Serenya replied, her voice carrying clearly despite the horn's ongoing song. "I'm revealing the truth. Your alpha abilities come from domination and exploitation. Mine come from healing and protection. The horn simply shows everyone which path leads to genuine strength." As if to demonstrate her point, she turned her attention to the wounded soldiers around her, not just healing their injuries this time, but awakening something deeper, the spark of potential that existed in anyone whose heart was truly loyal to something greater than themselves. Sergeant Greystone was the first to feel the change. His healed leg was only the beginning. Strength flowed through him that surpassed anything he had possessed even in his prime. When he picked up his sword, the blade seemed to sing with purpose, its steel taking on the same supernatural sharpness that marked Truthseeker in his king's hands. One by one, the other soldiers experienced similar transformations. Not Omega power that remained unique to the royal bloodlines, but something related to it. An enhanced version of their natural abilities that came from being recognized and valued by someone whose gift was seeing the true worth in others. "This is what Omega Queens really do," Serenya said to Cordelia, who watched the transformations with growing horror. "We don't rule through fear or dominance. We reveal the potential that already exists in good people and help them become the best versions of themselves." The horn's call reached its crescendo, and throughout the castle, the tide of battle turned decisively. King Alaric, his strength renewed and his weapon blazing with righteous power, began systematically dismantling the Alpha Raiders who had thought to overwhelm him through numbers and supernatural weaponry. Each strike of Truthseeker seemed to cut through more than flesh and steel. It severed the dark connections that bound the Alpha warriors to their corrupting power source. In the kitchens, Agnes led a group of servants who fought with the fierce protectiveness of people defending their homes. Their simple weapons, knives, rolling pins, even heavy pots, struck with impossible accuracy and force. Guided by the horn's revelation of their true worth, the stable boys moved through the castle's corridors with the silent efficiency of trained soldiers. Their knowledge of every hidden passage and secret entrance, allowing them to outmaneuver enemies who had studied the building's layout for months but never understood its heart. Even the castle itself seemed to join the battle more actively, its stones shifting to trap enemies while creating paths for defenders, its doors sealing against intruders while opening freely for those whose loyalty the horn had confirmed. Cordelia, realizing that her carefully planned operation was collapsing, made one last desperate gambit. Drawing upon alpha abilities that required her to sacrifice some of her own life force, she sent a lance of pure destructive energy toward the horn in Serenya's hands. If she could destroy the instrument, its unifying call would end, and her remaining forces might still have a chance to complete their mission. But the energy never reached its target. Serenya didn't even need to raise a defense. The horn's power created a barrier of solid sound that turned the attack aside like light reflecting off polished metal. "Your mistake," Serenya said, her voice gentle despite the supernatural forces swirling around her. is thinking that power comes from what you can destroy rather than what you can protect and nurture. The horn fell silent as she lowered it from her lips, but its effects continued to resonate through the castle. Every person within the walls now knew exactly where they stood in relation to the kingdom's true interests. Those with loyal hearts found themselves filled with strength and purpose. Those with treacherous intentions found themselves weakened and exposed. The first phase of the battle was over, but the confrontation that would determine the kingdom's future was just beginning. Lady Cordelia's ornate sword had been her pride since childhood, a blade forged with alpha techniques. That made it nearly indestructible, its edge keen enough to cut through conventional armor and weapons as if they were parchment. The blade of vanity, she had named it, for its surface was polished to mirror brightness and decorated with gems that caught light like captured stars. Now, as she faced the awakened power of an Omega Queen, the sword trembled in her hands like a living thing afraid of what it might encounter. "This ends now," Cordelia declared, raising the weapon above her head as alpha energy coursed through her body. "You may have awakened your bloodline gifts, but you're still untrained, untested in real combat. I've spent my entire life learning to counter Omega abilities." Serenya stood in the center of the transformed infirmary, the crown of Lysandra blazing on her head and the battle horn of unity glowing softly in her left hand. Around her, the wounded soldiers had formed a protective circle, their own enhanced abilities making them formidable guardians despite their recent injuries. "Lady Cordelia," Serenya said quietly, "this doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Your alpha abilities don't make you evil, only how you choose to use them. You could help people instead of hurting them." Cordelia's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Help people? Do you know what it's like to possess abilities that everyone fears? To spend your life being told that your power is inherently corrupt while Omega gifts are praised as noble and pure?" "I know what it's like to be judged by things beyond my control," Serenya replied. "But I also know that we choose who we become, regardless of the gifts we're born with." Pretty words from someone who's been handed everything she ever wanted. Cordelia's perfect features twisted with years of accumulated resentment. The king, the crown, the adoration of people who couldn't see past your false modesty to recognize what you really are. What am I, in your opinion? A weapon. The most dangerous kind, one that doesn't realize its own destructive potential. Cordelia began to circle her opponent, the blade of vanity, leaving trails of dark energy in the air. "You think your power comes from love and protection, but do you know what happens when an Omega loses someone they care about? When that protective instinct becomes rage." The question struck deeper than Serenya wanted to admit. She could feel the vast power flowing through her, connected to every person in the castle whose loyalty the horn had confirmed. If any of them were harmed, if King Alaric fell in battle, if the wounded soldiers around her were hurt, if even the kitchen staff were threatened, what might she do in response? "I see you understand," Cordelia continued. "The last Omega Queen to reach full power was Lysandra herself. Do you know how she died? Not in glorious battle defending her people, but consumed by her own rage when enemies captured and tortured her daughter. The power that had healed thousands turned destructive, and she leveled 3 enemy kingdoms before her fury burned out her own life force. The revelation sent ice through Serenya's veins. The chronicles had mentioned Queen Lysandra's death, but had been vague about the circumstances, focusing instead on her healing abilities and wise rule. "That's why the alpha bloodlines were developed," Cordelia pressed on, sensing advantage. "Not to destroy Omega power, but to contain it when it becomes too dangerous for the world to bear. We're the necessary counterbalance, the ones willing to make hard choices when compassion becomes destructive. By attacking my castle, by threatening innocent people, by preventing you from reaching full power and potentially destroying everything you claim to protect." Cordelia's blade sang through the air in a practice, cut that left reality itself seeming to split where it passed. One awakened Omega Queen nearly ended civilization 3 centuries ago. I won't allow you to repeat her mistakes. Serenya felt the truth in Cordelia's words, even as she recognized the flawed logic underlying them. Yes, great power could become dangerous when driven by grief or rage. But the answer wasn't to suppress all Omega abilities. It was to ensure they were guided by wisdom and surrounded by people who could provide balance and perspective. "You're afraid," she realized aloud. "Not of what I might become, but of what I represent. Proof that Alpha and Omega abilities don't have to be opposed to each other. Impossible. We're natural enemies, are we?" Serenya gestured to the transformed soldiers around her, men who had been enhanced by Omega power but retained their individual will and judgment. Or have we been taught to see each other that way by people who benefit from the conflict? Before Cordelia could respond, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. King Alaric appeared in the doorway, Truth-Seeker still blazing with supernatural light, his armor bearing the marks of recent battle. "The Great Hall is secured," he reported, his eyes taking in the scene before him with the rapid assessment of an experienced warrior. "But we've lost contact with the outer defenses." "How many of them are there?" "Enough," Cordelia replied, her attention now divided between two opponents. "And this is only the beginning. My employers have contingency plans that don't depend on capturing you alive." As if summoned by her words, a new voice echoed through the castle, amplified by what sounded like magical means, to reach every room and corridor simultaneously. "Attention! Defenders of Valdoria," the voice announced in accents that marked the speaker as coming from the far northern kingdoms. "Your castle is surrounded. Surrender the Omega Woman, and you may retain your lives. Continue to resist and face the consequences." Through her connection to the castle's stones, Serenya felt the truth of the threat. Hundreds of soldiers wearing the colors of 3 different kingdoms had taken positions around the building's outer walls. Siege engines designed to bring down supernatural defenses were being assembled in the courtyard. This had never been a simple raid. It was the opening move in a coordinated assault by multiple nations who viewed her awakening as a threat to regional stability. "You see?" Cordelia's voice held bitter satisfaction. "They won't allow another Omega Queen to reach full power, no matter how noble your intentions. Surrender yourself to me, and I can ensure you're treated with respect. Continue to resist, and they'll bring this entire castle down around you." King Alaric moved to stand beside Serenya. Truth-Seeker held in a defensive position that suggested he was prepared to fight impossible odds if necessary. "The choice is yours, my lady, but know that whatever you decide, you won't face it alone." The moment crystallized with perfect clarity. 3 paths stretched before her: surrender and hope that her captors would be merciful, flee and abandon everyone she had come to care about, or stand and fight against overwhelming odds with powers she was still learning to control. But as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, the wounded soldiers who had found new purpose through her healing, the king who had chosen her when no one else could see her worth, even Lady Cordelia, whose pain she was beginning to understand, Serenya realized there was a 4th option. "Lady Cordelia," she said, extending her hand toward her opponent, "you're right that Alpha and Omega abilities have been portrayed as natural enemies. But what if that's because people with power have always found it easier to maintain control by keeping us divided?" Cordelia's sword wavered slightly. What are you suggesting?" "That we work together. Your Alpha abilities to contain and focus power, my Omega gifts to heal and protect. Show these armies surrounding us what balanced supernatural abilities can actually accomplish." "You're naive," Cordelia said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The moment you trust me, I could turn that power against you." "Yes, you could," Serenya agreed. "Just as I could overwhelm your Alpha defenses with raw Omega force. But we're both stronger when we choose cooperation over conflict. For a heartbeat, possibility hung in the air like morning mist." Then the castle shook as the first siege engine found its range. Magical projectiles designed to pierce supernatural defenses, slamming into the outer walls with devastating force. "Decide quickly," King Alaric said grimly, "because ready or not, The real battle is beginning. Cordelia looked at her ornate sword, its mirrored surface reflecting not just her face, but the faces of everyone around her. People she had been prepared to hurt or kill in service of what she believed was a greater good. The blade of vanity had always shown her what she expected to see, her own beauty, her own righteousness, her own superiority. Now it showed her the truth. "I've spent so long believing that power meant never showing weakness," she said quietly, "never admitting I might be wrong." Another projectile struck the castle, and this time the ancient stones groaned under the impact. Whatever defenses Queen Lysandra had woven into the building's foundations 3 centuries ago, they were being tested by weapons specifically designed to counter them. "Strength isn't about never being wrong," Serenya said, still holding out her hand. "It's about being willing to change when you discover a better path." Cordelia's sword began to crack down its center, the alpha energies that had made it nearly indestructible now working against themselves as her certainty wavered. With each fissure that appeared in the blade, her perfect features showed more uncertainty and, surprisingly, hope. "If I help you," she said, "if we try this cooperation you speak of, what happens when your power grows too great to control? What happens when compassion isn't enough to contain the forces you're awakening?" "Then you'll be there to provide balance," Serenya replied. "Not as an enemy trying to destroy what I represent, but as a partner helping guide it toward constructive ends." The blade of vanity shattered completely, its fragments dissolving into motes of light that swirled around Cordelia like falling stars. But instead of leaving her defenseless, the breaking of the weapon seemed to free something that had been trapped within her alpha abilities, a potential for creation rather than destruction, for building rather than tearing down. "All right," she said, reaching out to take Serenya's offered hand. "Let's see if legends about Alpha-Omega partnerships were as wrong as everything else we've been taught." The moment their hands touched, power flowed between them in ways neither had imagined possible. Not the violent clash of opposing forces, but a harmony that amplified the strengths of both, while compensating for their individual weaknesses. Serenya's protective instincts found focus and direction through Cordelia's strategic mind. Cordelia's alpha dominance found purpose and meaning through Serenya's compassionate goals. Together, they turned their combined attention to the siege beginning outside. Through the castle's enhanced senses, they could perceive the attacking forces with perfect clarity. 3 armies, totaling nearly 2,000 soldiers, supported by siege engines that had cost fortunes to commission and transport. The commanders wore the colors of kingdoms that had historically competed for regional dominance, now united by shared fear of what an awakened Omega Queen might represent. But they also sensed something else, doubt among the common soldiers, many of whom had been told they were coming to contain a dangerous sorceress, but were beginning to question the wisdom of attacking a castle that had done them no harm. "The horn," Cordelia said, understanding flashing in her eyes. "If you could extend its range beyond the castle walls, could you help me focus the projection?" Serenya asked. "Channel it so it reaches only those with genuinely loyal hearts rather than overwhelming everyone indiscriminately." It was exactly the kind of partnership the ancient texts had hinted at but never explicitly described. Alpha precision guiding Omega power, creating effects that neither bloodline could achieve alone. Serenya raised the battle horn of unity to her lips once more, but this time Cordelia placed her hands on the instrument as well. Her alpha abilities creating a framework within which the horn's call could be shaped and directed. The note that emerged was different from before, still pure and beautiful, but focused with laser precision on those soldiers surrounding the castle who served out of genuine loyalty to their homelands rather than personal ambition or mercenary interest. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Across the 3 armies, common soldiers began laying down their weapons as the horn's call revealed the true nature of their mission. They had been told they were protecting their kingdoms from a dangerous threat, but the horn's truth-telling properties, showed them that they were actually participating in an unprovoked attack on a castle that posed no danger to anyone. Officers who had been motivated by promises of personal advancement found themselves paralyzed by the revelation of their own selfishness. But those few commanders, whose genuine concern for their people's welfare had led them to support this mission, felt the horn's call as validation and realized that their real duty lay in preventing unnecessary bloodshed rather than perpetuating it. Within minutes, the carefully coordinated assault began to collapse as entire units refused to continue the attack. Siege engines fell silent as their operators walked away. Supply lines dissolved as common soldiers chose conscience over obedience to corrupt orders. But the core of true believers, those who genuinely feared what Omega power represented, remained committed to their mission. And at their head, a figure in midnight black armor rode toward the castle's main gate, and power radiating from him that made even Cordelia's alpha abilities seem weak by comparison. "Alpha Prime," she whispered, her face going pale. "The first of our kind and the most powerful. If he's here personally, then this threat goes far beyond regional politics. The siege might be crumbling, but the real confrontation was just beginning. 1 year later, the royal scepter of Valdoria bore elements that no ceremonial weapon had ever contained before. Forged in the weeks following the battle that came to be known as the Convergence, it incorporated steel from King Alaric's sword Truthseeker, silver from Lady Serenya's mother's locket, and fragments of crystal from the shattered blade of Vanity. The fusion of materials represented something unprecedented in the kingdom's history, a symbol of leadership that drew strength from warrior courage, healing compassion, and the wisdom to transform opposition into alliance. The confrontation with Alpha Prime had ended not in the destructive battle that everyone expected, but in a revelation that changed how supernatural abilities were understood throughout the known world. The ancient figure who had seemed to embody alpha power at its most dangerous turned out to be something far more complex. The last survivor of the original conflict between Alpha and Omega bloodlines, driven not by malice, but by centuries of guilt over his role in the wars that had nearly destroyed both lineages. When Serenya and Cordelia approached him together, their combined power radiating harmony instead of conflict, he had wept openly for the first time in 300 years. "I have spent lifetimes believing that our abilities made us natural enemies," he had said, his ancient voice carrying the weight of accumulated sorrow. "Watching you work together shows me what we might have become if fear hadn't driven us to violence." The peace negotiations that followed established principles that revolutionized international relations. The Valdoria Accords created frameworks for identifying and training individuals with supernatural abilities, ensuring they used their gifts in service of others rather than personal ambition. Alpha and Omega bloodlines would be taught together, their complementary nature emphasized rather than suppressed. Most importantly, the Accords established that supernatural abilities were tools to be guided by character, not weapons to be wielded for dominance. Now, as Queen Serenya stood in the great hall that had once witnessed her mockery and humiliation, she reflected on how completely the world had changed. The wedding ceremony earlier that day had been attended by representatives from a dozen kingdoms, many of whom had come specifically to witness the union that symbolized a new age of cooperation between former enemies. Lady Cordelia, resplendent in robes that marked her new position as the kingdom's first Alpha-Omega liaison, had served as one of the wedding's witnesses. The role suited her perfectly. Her strategic mind and reformed Alpha abilities made her invaluable in training. The growing number of individuals whose supernatural gifts were awakening throughout the realm. "Your Majesty," she said now, approaching with a scroll that bore the seals of multiple kingdoms. The final reports from the autumn harvest. Serenya accepted the document, scanning its contents with the practiced efficiency she had developed over months of learning statecraft. The numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Crop yields increased through omega-enhanced farming techniques, disease rates reduced by healers trained in proper use of their abilities. Trade disputes resolved through alpha-assisted negotiations that could detect deception and compel honesty. Remarkable, she murmured. The southern provinces are reporting their best harvest in living memory. It seems, Cordelia said with a smile that held none of its old calculated coldness, that people work more effectively when their contributions are genuinely valued. Through the tall windows of the great hall, evening light painted the courtyard in shades of gold and amber. The space that had once been used primarily for military training now served multiple purposes: healing centers where Omega-gifted individuals learned to channel their abilities constructively, strategic planning rooms where alpha talents were applied to solving logistical challenges, and gathering spaces where people from all walks of life could contribute their skills to the kingdom's welfare. The transformation extended far beyond the castle walls. Throughout Valdoria, communities that had once been stratified by rigid social hierarchies were discovering that true prosperity came from recognizing and nurturing the potential in every individual. The same insight that had led Serenya to see worth in overlooked soldiers had become the foundation for a new approach to governance. King Alaric appeared at her side, moving with the quiet confidence that had first attracted her attention. Marriage had deepened their partnership in ways that went beyond romantic love. They had become true collaborators in the work of ruling, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. "The evening reports from the border provinces," he said, offering her another set of documents. "All quiet. It seems our neighbors have decided that diplomatic solutions are preferable to military. And it's hard to wage war against a kingdom where half the population can sense your true intentions and the other half can heal the damage you inflict," Serenya observed with dry humor. "And where the Queen's reputation for turning enemies into allies makes conquest seem less appealing than partnership," Alaric added. It was true. Over the past year, 3 separate kingdoms had approached Valdoria with requests for assistance in identifying and training their own supernatural bloodlines. What had begun as fear of Omega power had evolved into recognition that such abilities, properly guided, could benefit entire populations. The memorial garden, visible through the western windows, had become one of Serenya's most treasured projects. The garden honored not just the soldiers who had fought in the great battle, but everyone throughout the kingdom's history who had shown kindness without expectation of reward, who had valued character over appearance, who had chosen compassion over convenience. Each plant in the garden had been chosen for its healing properties, making the space both a place of remembrance and a living pharmacy where future healers could learn to recognize the herbs that might save lives. The garden's central monument bore a simple inscription: "To those who see worth where others see only surface. Your vision shapes the world, Your Majesty." A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Sergeant Greystone, now fully healed and serving as captain of the Royal Guard, approached with the measured stride of a soldier, comfortable with his responsibilities. "The evening patrol reports are ready for your review." She accepted the documents gratefully, noting that his leg showed no trace of the wound that had once threatened to end his military service. Like many others throughout the kingdom, he had discovered that proximity to awakened Omega power could enhance natural healing and reveal hidden potentials. "Any concerns, Captain?" "Nothing that requires immediate attention, Your Majesty. Though I should mention that young Tom from the kitchens has been asking if there might be a place for him in the guard training program." Serenya smiled, remembering the baker's apprentice, whose pepper reaction had been her first real demonstration of healing ability. "And what do you think?" "I think," Greystone said diplomatically, "that anyone whose life was saved by their future queen's intervention might have excellent motivation to serve the crown faithfully." As the sun set over the kingdom she now helped to rule, Queen Serenya found herself thinking about the woman who had stood in this same hall just over a year ago, plain, overlooked, certain that her worth lay in quiet service rather than public recognition. That woman could never have imagined the path that lay before her, the abilities she would discover, the love she would find, or the ways she would help transform not just one kingdom, but the entire understanding of what leadership could mean. The simple silver locket still hung around her neck, its pressed violet a reminder of simpler times when her worth had seemed measured entirely by others' opinions. Now she understood that true value had always come from within, from the choices she made, the kindness she showed, the strength she found to help others, even when no one was watching. King Alaric took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers as they stood together in the hall where their story had begun. The ring that had blazed with supernatural light during their betrothal now glowed with the steady warmth of enduring partnership, its ancient magic satisfied by a love that had grown from mutual respect into something deeper and more enduring. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, his voice meant for her alone. She looked around the great hall, where nobles who had once mocked her now served with genuine respect, where the castle staff moved with the confidence of people who knew their contributions were valued, where former enemies had become trusted allies. Through the windows, she could see the lights of a kingdom where supernatural abilities were guided by wisdom rather than feared as threats, where leadership meant service rather than dominance, where worth was measured by character rather than appearance. Only one, she said, turning to smile at the man who had seen her value when no one else could. "That it took so long to understand what you saw in me from the beginning. And what was that? That the heart willing to heal others, even at personal cost, possesses the rarest strength of all." As night settled over Valdoria, the castle's stones hummed with contentment, ancient magic finally at peace, after centuries of waiting for rulers who understood that true power came not from commanding others, but from inspiring them to become the best versions of themselves. The transformation was complete, but the story it represented would echo through generations. A reminder that worth is never determined by surface appearances, and that the greatest queens are often found among those whom others dismiss as unremarkable. In the end, Lady Serenya's greatest magic had always been her ability to see potential where others saw only limitations, in wounded soldiers, in herself, and ultimately in the very nature of what it meant to rule with wisdom, compassion, and the understanding that every person possesses value, waiting to be recognized and nurtured. The kingdom that had once mocked the ugly Omega bride now flourished, under the guidance of a queen who had learned that true beauty comes from the courage to remain kind in a world that often rewards cruelty, and that genuine strength lies not in perfection, but in the willingness to help others discover their own hidden worth.